Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello and welcome to episode 79 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast with me, Rory Lees-Oakes, and my fellow confluent presenter. See what I did there? A bit of Gestalt theory. Confluent presenter, which means always being joined together as one. Mr. Ken Kelly. How you doing, Ken?
I'm good. It's great to be here. Episode 79, a real value-packed episode that we have for you today. We're going to be kicking off by looking at feelings of incompetence, almost imposter syndrome. So that can be related to your studies, the assignments that you may do, but it also shows itself when we go into practice, feeling inadequate. Am I really okay for this client? Going to be a good one, that, Rory. Looking forward to it. Looking at practice matters with Rory today. Working with a third person in the room. And it was interesting because just running into the podcast, we always have a bit of a catch up. And I was asking Rory about this. Tell us about third person in the room.
Well, yes, sometimes we are asked to work with a third person in the room. And the people I'm thinking about, if you're a child therapist, it could be with a parent initially. Mm-hmm. It could be with a translator. It's very possible it's a translator. And in some cases, it could be a support worker. You can get clients who are so nervous, they need a little bit of extra support in the room initially as the therapy starts to work forward. And I'm going to be talking about how you contract for that and things you need to consider around it. I
like that. And again, something that is very rarely covered in training because it's not asked for in the awarding body criteria, but so important when that comes up. What do? Listen to that one. And then we're going to be ending episode 79 today, looking at completing your placement hours as a placement counsellor. And the deadline is coming closer and closer to hand in that portfolio. Do I have enough hours? Will I get my hours in? How do I log those hours? All of that really important stuff that we're hearing from you in our counselling tutor Facebook group. So lots to cover today. Let's kick off with that. Feelings of incompetence. It's almost imposter syndrome, I think, is another word for that, Rory. When are they going to find out that I'm just faking all of this?
Yes, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people who's listening to this episode, excuse me, who say, that's me, that is. And imposter syndrome was actually coined in 1978 by Dr. Pauline R. Clance and Susan A. Limes. And it really referred to really high-achieving individuals who couldn't acknowledge their accomplishments, if you like. But it's really interesting because when I trained, and I, like a lot of other therapists, felt I wasn't doing a good job. And I thought it was just me. And through the years of training and being a supervisor, it's a theme that comes up both in training and in supervision. And in fact, it's acknowledged in the Means and Thorn book, Person-Centered Counselling in Action, because they talk about feelings of incompetence, FOI, feelings of incompetence. And those can be around not feeling you're doing a good enough job, excuse me, not feeling that for some reason you're applying the theory, not feeling real enough in the room. And it's really interesting, and it does come up a lot, Ken. And I don't know if you can remember when we taught that coming up quite a lot for some of our students.
Definitely, and I can relate to it from hearing it from students, and I can relate to it from supervisees that I work with that bring that from time to time. And I can recognize it from my own feelings of incompetence. Am I good enough when going in with clients? And it's really interesting because I guess it's about our own self-development, how we view ourselves, our self-concept, and what expectations we may feel are upon us, the stakes of the counselling relationship. And I know that I struggled with it, specifically in my early days, in my placement days. And I remember taking it to supervision time and time again and feeling, I'll be honest with you, Rory, quite ashamed to bring it up with my supervisor. You know, am I good enough? Am I serving this client in their best needs? Am I doing this right? Was where I was kind of coming from. And through working with my supervisor pretty closely, we really examined that and looked at the theory, working as a person-centered therapist as I was at that time, we looked at what the theory was, and the theory was that the necessary and sufficient conditions were necessary, and they were sufficient. That was all that was needed, and that was all that I needed to take in with me. I didn't need to know everything about every single kind of presentation a client might bring to me within the moment. That wasn't what it was all about. But I do recognize that those feelings run strong, and I wonder how they can taint the counselling relationship if you're taking that in with you into the relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, we don't want to give people the sense that they're failing because they might have these feelings. But I would go and perhaps visit our old friend transference.
Yeah.
Because it's amazing when we examine, certainly in supervision, these feelings of incompetence, this imposter syndrome, it usually links back at some level to messages that someone's had in the past about how competent they are. And in fact, in some cases, direct kind of criticism where someone said, well, you'll never make a good therapist because you talk too much, or you'll never make a good therapist because you've got problems of your own.
Wow.
And I've heard that. I've heard that as a trainer, and I've heard that as a supervisor through the years. And it really is about trainers and supervisors really supporting, not rescuing, but supporting people through that. And it is more prevalent than you'd think. But in my experience, it is always, always, always linked to transference at some level.
Definitely. I guess thinking about what the therapeutic relationship is at its most basic level, a therapeutic relationship, a counseling relationship, is two human beings being together in a room, and one human being, the counselor, really caring why the other person is there, really listening to what it is that they're bringing, and listening in a way that you put yourself in their shoes, try and see how it is for them and what they're feeling. And that's what counselling is about. Yes, there is the theory that underpins what it is that we do. Yes, we do have to have understanding of the ethics and that kind of makes therapy work. But at the end of the day, you're just taking in yourself, and it's about recognizing that you are good enough. And that is, I guess, the journey we take, that personal discovery journey, so vitally important as part of becoming a therapist, so that we can look at ourselves, see maybe the parts of ourselves that were unseen before, parts that need work, parts where we feel that need growth, but be accepting of that in the same way as we are accepting of our client. And I think if we just take our true selves in, that is more than good enough.
Indeed, and it's the words echoed by Carl Rogers himself, who very famously was giving an exhibition of person-centered therapy to an audience of clinicians, and he had the clients, and he said, I'm going to demonstrate what person-centered therapy is. And he walked towards the client, and then he stopped and turned around back to face the audience and said, what's important is in this encounter, I am just good enough to be me.
Wow.
There you have it.
I think for me, that was the solution to imposter syndrome. It was that made me able to dissipate those feelings of inadequacy. Am I good enough? It was that realization that the me of me is good enough, and that's it. Really, it's not about the theory. It's not about understanding their presentation fully and knowing all the ins and outs about that, because that's the client's job to understand where they're coming from. We just need to be there and warmly accept and receive what they're bringing. Yeah,
and don't underestimate that, because that's something they may not be getting anywhere else. That ability to be able to talk about the problems. One of the things that has amazed me through the years, I've done many courses, got more understanding of brain plasticity and attachments and all sorts of different psychological issues that affect people. But one of the things that is always, always a constant, even with that knowledge, is just the ability to be able to sit and allow the client the space to tell their story. That for me is probably the most healing aspect of being a counsellor, not what I know.
100%. We're speaking about imposter syndrome, or that feeling of, am I doing this right? So often, that's where our clients are coming into us. They're coming in from that same viewpoint. Am I good enough? Am I good enough in the world? Am I good enough in my relationship? Am I good enough in my work? That incongruence is trying to act differently or be differently, act in a way that is more acceptable to other people. And we go on the journey together to say, you know what? You are good enough just how you are. You are a wonderful, beautiful person. And in the same way, we can take that and reflect it on ourselves in our own personal development to help ourselves. And you're 100% right, Rory. I mean, where in life these days do you have that held space where you can bring what you're bringing, whatever you choose to bring, and not be judged? And you see that when clients come in, they step tentatively when they first come in. Can I bring this information? You might think I'm mad when I tell you this, they may say. Why? Because they've been judged before, because everybody that they may share their stuff with is going to give them advice, tell them what they could do, what they should do, where they went wrong. We just need to give them that space. I think the imposter syndrome is a really good topic, because I think that it is on both sides. For the client coming in, for us as therapists, we experience it too.
Yeah, it speaks of something that's very strong in person-centered therapy. It speaks of incongruence.
Yes.
And that's the thing. If someone isn't accepting what they're doing, then at some level they're being incongruent with themselves. And I think it's interesting, certainly as a supervisor, to explore what that's about and why people feel like that. And I guess there's a sphere, there's a kind of arc, isn't there, at two ends. And at one end is you rust out because you're not using your skills and you're not using any of the theories, and at the other end you burn out. And I think with imposter syndrome, people perhaps try to be overdo themselves, and it might end up with people burning out. It's okay to be yourself. And the big message from this, I think, it's okay to make mistakes. People make mistakes in therapy, and sometimes the mistakes you make aren't as big as you think. I mean, there are things that are unacceptable and can get you into difficulty. But if you spend your time checking yourself out, should I have said this? Should I have said that? How present are you?
Yeah, very much so. And it's interesting. This we could really take this topic along many different roads. That you take after the fact, after the session, that you now, the client said this and then I said that. I wonder what would happen if I said that. Should I rather have said that? What did they think when I said that? That can lead down a very windy and dark road. And when I work with my supervisees, one of the things that I share and I reflect is whatever it was that you said in that moment in therapy was right, because it was immediate, it was with you as you said it. We can now look at maybe if a similar presentation comes up, how you might work with that differently, but that was said during that moment was right. And when you do put something out there and it's not right within a therapeutic relationship, you'll feel it. You'll feel it straight away. You'll feel it at your core. It will resonate. It will clang like a bell. And if that happens, there is the opportunity to say to the client, you know what, I just said blah, 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 and it doesn't feel right for me. As I was saying it, it just felt wrong. I wonder how that feels for you. And there you go. That is out of the way, and you don't need to worry about that. Interesting topic. Absolutely love it. But we have more topics to bring today. We're going to be looking in Practice Matters at working with a third person in the room. Tell us more, Rory.
Well, yes. I mean, there will be times, and they may be infrequent, where we may have a client who needs an extra form of support. And that could be, say, an interpreter. It could be, if it's a child, it might be a parent or a teacher. And if it's someone who may be having real emotional difficulties, a support worker. I know of someone who I personally know, whose first session they had the support worker sit in the room with the therapist, just because they needed that form of support. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about how we deal with that, how we work with that, some of the things we need to be aware of, and also about how to appropriately contract for working with effectively another person in the room.
Let's get right into that with Practice Matters.
Practice Matters.
Working with a third person in the room. There are times when we may find ourselves working with a third person in the room. We may have a client who is not an English speaker, and unless you are bilingual, you may find yourself working with an interpreter. Sometimes you may have a client who is deaf and uses sign language to communicate, and again, unless you're a signer, you may find yourself working with someone who needs to interpret. Some clients that may have a support worker and ask they come into sessions because they feel nervous. And finally, a third person can be a recording device, an unseen person in many respects, and one whose presence is silent and unemotional. So how do we work with interpreters or third persons in the room? Well, I'd like to acknowledge Lorraine Quinn. She's a UKCP registered integrative psychotherapist with an academic background in linguistics and textual criticism. She's written a blog post on research that she's undertaken, and I'm indebted to her for making her observations available online, and I'll put a link to her website in the show notes. She observes that the system which within clients currently receive help might not always be described as ideal, but all participants were conscious as individuals of the need to find ways to make their work effective, ethical, and as culturally appropriate as possible within the available resources. So there's real acknowledgement there that working with a third person in the room may not always be easy or ideal, but those who did really made an effort to make sure what they did was effective, it was ethical, and it was as culturally appropriate as possible within the available resources. So it may and almost certainly will ask you to work in a different way than you would if you were working with just the clients in the room. But you're going to have to make some compromises and make sure that you're offering the really best service given the situation that you find yourself in. There are some practical aspects of working with a third person in a room. First of all, you should never let a family member be an interpreter. The reason for this is that family members may have an agenda and may either misinterpret what the client said, or the client may very well not be willing to speak about the issues they're having because the family member may be part of those issues. So those who translate should be neutral of the client and trained in interpretation, although it should be acknowledged that interpreters from the same cultural background may have shared cultural experiences. Be sure to have a triangulation in contract in place so all concerned are aware of issues around confidentiality and responsibilities. So everybody contracts or should contract at the beginning of therapy. Working with a third person in the room is no different. However, you make sure that everybody understands the limits of confidentiality, the policies of the organisation and procedures, and that everybody has a copy of the contract. And almost certainly, if you're working with an interpreter, you're going to have to write a special contract around that, acknowledging that there is an interpreter or a third person in the room. If the third person is a recording device, who will hear the recording and what are the counsellor's obligations under the General Data Protection Regulations? GDPR is now in force, and as a consequence of that, it's very possible that a client may be acutely aware of their rights under this legislation. So you're going to have to be thinking about who listens to the recording, where is it stored, how long are you going to keep it, can the client ask for it to be deleted and erased? All these issues come up, and again, this should form part of a specific contract if you are recording a client. Because of the nature of the material brought, you may wish to debrief the interpreter or at least speak with them on their own after the session. And in fact, the research that Lorraine Quinn undertook indicated that some counsellors did indeed debrief their interpreters after, and that's just giving someone maybe 5 minutes just to check out they're okay, and if something's been brought up for them, maybe refer them on for their own therapy. So it's just generally about making sure they're okay and they're not affected by what's been said. It may be that an interpreter cannot pick up all the nuances of the client's dialogue, such as a slip of the tongue. Although interpreters are very good, and a trained interpreter will not only interpret what's being said, but the emotion behind it, they cannot sometimes pick up everything. They translate after the client's spoken. So they're in the process of translating. If there's a slip of the tongue or a client says something, they may not pick it up. So it's always worth remembering that sometimes there is some loss in translation, and you need to be aware of that. And finally, a bit more of a practical aspect of working the translator. Remember, always face the client and listen to the interpreter. This can be challenging as we do tend to look toward the person we can understand. So if we have two people in front of us, one of us speaking in a language we don't understand and the other is speaking in a language that we do understand, there is a tendency for humans to turn to the person they can understand. And obviously that slips you out of the client's frame of reference and takes your attention off them. So it is something that you have to be disciplined with. And I have to say, it's not always easy. Lorraine Quinn also makes an interesting reference to how a counsellor may gain learning or cultural insights into working with an interpreter. And she states, the role of interpreter, however, could be more complex than one of a cultural broker, translating both the words and nuances that accompany them. Participants gave examples of how interpreters explain cultural, social and historical context, either at the request of the counsellor or spontaneously, and how the resulting collaboration contributed to the counsellor's knowledge base for the future. Now, I think this is interesting because sometimes what is being said isn't always easily understandable without context. So it may be useful for a counsellor to check the context out with the interpreter to fully understand maybe the family dynamics, something around family dynamics, not understanding why a client would have a response to a member of the family in the way the client did. And sometimes the interpreter may give an example of that spontaneously, or, a therapist may ask. It does seem counterintuitive because we're always told not to ask questions. But as it's stated at the beginning, sometimes we have to make adjustments in the way we work when we have an interpreter in the room to make sure that we're getting the full picture. In other words, interpreters may be able to offer an added dimension to the counsellor's awareness of the client's frame of reference. And finally, I think it's worth remembering that we do actually all, as humans, share a common language, that of kindness, compassion, the need to be heard and the need to be validated. And that's a universal language that is as much seen and felt as it is heard.
Thank you, as always, Rory. Really, really important topic to look at, that third person in the room. And I'm mindful that if you are recording your session, that there is a third person in the room, because there is a recorder there that could potentially be listened to by a supervisor if you're taking that information to supervision, or by somebody who might be looking at your skills, evaluating your skills, maybe in peer discussion in a contracted environment within your learning institution. So really interesting that we can find ourselves with a third person in the room even without consciously knowing it. And it just goes back to how important that contracting is. Thank you so much, Rory, for that. And of course, if you want Rory's super duper handout that you can get by going to counsellingtutor.com. That's our mother website. In the top bar, you just click on the podcast link. That's going to take you through to our podcast page. Go to episode 79, today's episode, and all the show notes from today's episode are there, including Rory's super duper handout that you can download and keep. And of course, if you're a member of our paid for resource, which is the Counselling Study Resource and Handouts Vault, well, that handout has already been added to your file, so you can log in and access that immediately. If you're wondering what our paid for resource is, we'll tell you more about that at the end of today's episode, so stay tuned for that. But moving on, and we're going into a tricky area. It's the completion of the placement hours. You've got your submission of your final portfolio, your final bits of work, but you also have to finish a certain number of hours, which differs, I guess, from course to course, and submit those hours as well. And it can be a lot all at the same time. Am I going to get those hours done? Oh, but there's more to it, because it's not just the hours, it's about evidencing those hours as well, Rory.
It is, and one of the things that has sometimes disappointed students who've submitted final portfolios is that the awarding bodies have discounted hours because they've gone over the supervision ratios.
Yes.
So if you're compiling your portfolios, you need to check what your awarding body considers a month. Now, if I talk about the awarding body consortium, or centre as it is now, ABC, their documentation says it's 31 days. A month is 31 days. So that you have supervision on one day, and 31 days later, within then, you should have supervision again. And if people go over, you can kind of claim, you can claim up to 7 days in exceptional circumstances, but your supervisor really does need to put a letter of comfort in, a letter of support explaining why it ran over, and they won't allow you to keep running over. So that is built in. So when you're adding your hours up, just make sure the dates are within that 31-day window. And also something on hours. When I first took over the provision, when I first started, there was people submitting 15 minutes and 20 minutes and 10 minutes. And we had to have a conversation and say, no, it's got to be an hour. You've got to have an hour, or the 50-minute hour, which is even more confusing, but actually a client in the room for an hour. And interestingly, again, with some awarding bodies, if you're working with children, they will allow you to claim half an hour, but you have to make it clear. So my message to those of you who have completed your hours, you've got your logs, is make sure that paperwork is absolutely tip-top, absolutely really clear, that your hours are hours and that you're within those 31-day window. And if you're not, that you've got letters of explanation why, because there's nothing worse than getting your results to find out you've been referred because your logs are not complete.
It's tricky. It is tricky, and they do refer a lot because of that. If it's not complete, if it is out, they are going to refer, and it's a balance, because there's an element of mathematics. You have to look at your hours that you've done in your placement. You have to now link that to your supervised hours. Make sure you haven't run over. It can be complex, and it's well worth going through it with your tutor. Going through it with your peers, doing a workshop in it in your learning institution, getting others to look over your hours for you. So easy to miscalculate it. Get others to look over it for you. So that's one element of that causes anxiety leading up to the submission of the portfolio. And another element that causes anxiety is, will I make my hours? I'm only on 40 hours. There are other people within my group, they're already on 90 hours. I'm not going to make it on time. What do we do, Rory?
We don't panic.
You think that my voice was definitely insinuating panic there? What do we do, Rory?
I have to say there was a bit of transference there from all the students I've talked to in the past who've had that exact conversation. I have to say, that's exact pitch of voice that Ken used. And the thing is, most awarding bodies will allow you to go over the curriculum time. So the end dates on courses are usually quite long. So if you start a 2-year course, you can complete usually, and you'd have to check the specs within about 18 months after you've finished the course. But do check the specs. But sometimes the reality is you'll get to the end of your course and you'll be a few hours missing. Yeah. And it's just one of those things. We talked about last week. I talked about DNAs, about people not attending, and it does happen. And you just have to just take it as part of training to be a therapist. It's not particularly fair, but as I said last week, life's not fair. But also that feeling when you hit that 100-hour. I can remember the feeling for me, Ken, when the client went out and the client went out and we went out and I sat there in my therapy room going, yes, 100 hours, that's it. I've got across that particular finish line. It's a great thing, and we see lots of people celebrating the 100 hours in the Facebook group, because it is a big part of the journey.
Of course it is. It is. It's exciting. And we're speaking about the not hitting the 100 hours, maybe being on 75 hours when all your peers are submitting their final portfolios with their hours. It's okay. You have the time. You can submit your portfolio in its completion when those hours are done. However, here's a tip. If you have hours outstanding, Complete your portfolio anyway. In other words, do the written work. Don't be lulled into, tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to, because I haven't done all my hours, I'm not going to do that section of my portfolio yet because I can't submit it anyway. Don't do that, because what tends to happen is you come to the end of your study journey, you have your final group meeting where the group disbands and you all say, oh, we'll catch up and we'll speak on Facebook and we'll keep in touch. And then you all go your separate ways. And suddenly there is no accountability. There's no class where you're being asked to show your work. There's no group dynamics to bounce yourself off. You're on your own. And it's so much more difficult to revisit that work and do that when you're on your own. So try and get your written work done in its entirety. And what if you have outstanding hours, and then just wait for your hours to come in, add that to your portfolio, hand that in with your tutor, and that can be submitted for you.
Yeah, and we've talked a lot today about 100 hours.
Yes.
I'm aware that some courses have 120, 150, 200 hours. So, not all courses have the same amount of hours. But yeah, it is a milestone. It's one of those things when people hit them, and it's interesting. It's interesting you talk about motivation, because my experience has been that if people hit them prior to finishing the course, sometimes the motivation kind of flags a bit because they've thought that they've got across the finish line. Of course, it's not the finish line. It's part of the criteria. So yeah, and Ken is absolutely right. Make sure you do your portfolios when you're in college with your group, because as soon as that dissipates, it's very difficult to keep the motivation. Some people can, but it's all about motivation. It's a long slog.
It is. One final point from my side on this is if your awarding body is asking for 100 supervised hours to evidence your placement, submit 100 supervised hours. So if you've done 140 hours because you finished your 100 hours months before your peers, there is no merit, there's no reason for you to submit the additional hours. Submit the 100 hours that they ask for with the dates and the supervision. That's what they're asking for. Goes back to what Rory speaks about often. Answer the question they're asking. Where are your 100 hours? Here are my 100 hours. Not here are my 140 hours. Here are my 100 hours. Give them just what they need. Yeah,
and one tip where people fall literally at the finish line is that they going to put the portfolio in, and eager to put the portfolio in. In that month, they've done 3 hours and they've got the 100 hours, but they've not been to supervision.
Oh, yeah.
And the awarding body have a huge red pen. They don't have a red pen. But what they do is they strike those 3 hours off because they're not supervised. It's all about the criteria. They're supervised hours. You cannot just add 3 hours at the end and then, I'll go for supervision after the portfolio submitted. No. You need to have them supervised. Every hour needs to be signed off and supervised.
Yeah, the criteria is that strict. If you have 99 supervised hours and one that is not, they will refer that portfolio. It is that strict, those criteria. Well, there it is. There's a little information on those final hours. If you're in placement, working towards that now, I know it's that time of year where so many are working towards putting their final bits of work together in placement, counting those hours. Hopefully that will be useful for you. We kicked off episode 79 today looking at feeling of inadequacy, that imposter syndrome within ourselves. And we even looked at how it might be for a client coming in feeling those same feelings. In Practice Matters, working with a third person in the room. And of course, we closed today looking at completing those hours. We love your topics. We work from our Facebook group. If you're not a member, get into that Facebook group. Go into Facebook, put in the word Counselling Tutor. We're right at the top. Come and join tens of thousands of like-minded individuals from all around the world. We just submerge ourselves in counselling and the topics of study all the time. Rory was just mentioning people celebrating their 100 hours right there in the Facebook group. Jump in. It is really nice, and we would love to have you if you're not already a member. If you are a member, we want to hear from you. What do you think? What are the topics you want to hear on this podcast? Because this podcast belongs to you.
It does. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take care. If you enjoy the topics and handouts here on the Counselling Tutor Podcast, then you will love the Counselling Study Resource. CSR was built by myself, Ken, and Rory Lees-Oakes to give you the support you need during your counselling studies. So get access to the world's most comprehensive collection of resources aimed at supporting you in your journey to become a counsellor. Take the stress out of your studies by visiting counsellingtutor.com/CSR. That's counsellingtutor.com/CSR.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.